Of Martin Buber. His depictions of woman and the feminine range from the most traditional to the most progressive. He was in some respects at the forefront of his time, claiming equality for women and praising their importance for a Jewish Renaissance. But he was also very much a man of his time. One finds in his writings age-old stereotypes, both exaltations of woman as personification of the sublime and terrifying female demons on the one hand, reminding women of their role as domestic caretakers, homemakers, and supportive helpers of men. One of the most daring, and in terms of Buber's philosophy, most complex ideas of femininity arise where Buber amalgamates these polarities. This occurs, as I will argue, in particularly striking ways in his association of woman with world. In the final part of my talk, I will, in the spirit of the conference's title, give voice to one of his most eccentric female acquaintances and readers, the poet, painter, and performance artist Else Lasker-Schüler, whose own idiosyncratic understanding of world, subjectivity, and singularity present a striking challenge to Buber's constructions of woman as world. Woman as world echoes an old and ominous popular allegory called in German Frau Welt. This figure, whose name is not quite adequately because too daintily translated into English as Lady World, was a widespread motif in the Middle Ages, particularly in German medieval Christian art, literature, and sculpture. Its most powerful representation can still be found on the facade of cathedrals, mainly in cities along the Rhineland. It warned against the deceiving allure of worldly attractions through a uniquely deceptive female appearance. Frau Welt's attractive front side conceals a horrid back covered with toads, snakes, and worms. This sculpture of Frau Welt on the portal of the Cathedral of Worms has a beautiful front side. She smiles serenely while a tiny knight clings to the hem of her dress. He gazes at her adoringly. She doesn't seem to notice. His disproportionately small stature emphasizes her might, but her back reveals the truth about her. It is covered by abject creatures. Frau Welt is an allegory for vanity, a symbol for all that is evil and sinful in the world, hidden behind a seductive facade. She was a favorite character in German morality tales and sermons around 1300 when the Worms Cathedral was constructed. Here's an even more horrid depiction. I think this one is in Strasbourg. There is something peculiar and particularly relevant about the Worms sculpture. Next to Frau Welt stands, do you recognize it? Maybe you see what this is?
The synagogue.
The synagogue, exactly. Next to Frau Welt stands the blindfolded synagogue, the notorious Christian depiction of Judaism as blind to the light of Christ. The two figures, synagogue and Frau Welt, stand side by side, while their counterpart looms above them in all its glory. A Madonna as a saint, and next to it the allegory of the church, Ecclesia. This coupling was an instance of the patristic view of Judaism, that it was a carnal, depraved religion in contrast to the spiritual vision of the church. It conveyed the warning that the world was inherently deceptive and that any knight of faith that would succumb to the charms of Frau Welt, as Judaism does, will end up in a toad's pond, a viper's nest, and a worm-eaten grave. Calling the small knight at the feet of Frau Welt an endangered knight of faith, a prominent term in Søren Kierkegaard's writings, leads us to the first example, and I will have three, in our exploration of Buber's association of woman with world. The first sentences of his text, Die Frage an den Einzelnen, the question to the single one, a lecture he presented in Switzerland in 1933 as part of his dialogical writings, is a critique of Kierkegaard's renunciation of his fiancée, Regina. In the central sentence of the first paragraph of this text, Buber writes, Kierkegaard's single one cannot be understood without his solitariness, which differed in kind from the solitariness of one of the earlier Christian thinkers such as Augustine or Pascal, whose name one would like to link with Kierkegaard. It is not irrelevant that beside Augustine stood a mother, and beside Pascal a sister, who maintained the organic connection with the world as only a woman, the envoy of elemental life, can. Whereas the central event of Kierkegaard's life and the core of the crystallization of his thought was the renunciation of Regina Olsen as representing woman and world. Twice in this paragraph, and a third time later in the text, Buber thus associates woman with world. First, he suggests that as an envoy of elemental, thus primal, natural life, woman alone can provide an organic connection to the world. Buber then describes Kierkegaard's giving up of his fiancée Regina for the sake of a life in God in terms of a renunciation of woman and world. While the first instance is merely a metonymic construction, the second, repeated in the third formulation as we will see, suggests a metaphorical one. In the first instance, woman for Buber is an organic link to the world, an envoy and thus part of the world. The second formulation makes them actually fall together. In simultaneously representing woman and world, the concrete singular woman Regina, whom Kierkegaard relinquished, becomes world. Regina, as well as Augustine's mother and Pascal's sister, appear less as a singular thou than as what one would expect Buber to see as its opposite, not the concrete uniqueness of an addressed other, but first the representative, then the embodiment of a species, the species of womanhood and the token of worldliness as such. With the equation woman is world, we are not far from the allegory of woman as world, but not quite there yet. While the small knight on the facade of the Worms Cathedral lets himself be seduced by the beautiful appearance of woman and world, Kierkegaard, as true knight of faith, does not. Buber, in this passage, is explicitly critical of Kierkegaard's sacrifice of Regina for a life in God. In this text and elsewhere, Buber insists that the closeness to God must go through and not away from the world. It can be, he writes, in der Einzelne in der Verantwortung, the single one in responsibility, that the relationship of the human person to God is constituted by a rejection, ein Weglassen, or abandonment of the world. It cannot be that one finds God's hands by reaching beyond the world. This corresponds to Buber's central idea that in accordance with the majority of thinkers in Judaism, the proximity to God expresses itself through turning to rather than away from the world. According to Buber, Kierkegaard wrongly believed that woman, das Weib, is the temptation to finitude when he sacrificed his fiancée to God. The Regina Olsens of this world, Buber writes, are not the obstacles on the road to God, they are the road. Buber finds this attitude confirmed in Kierkegaard's own words. No one, Buber writes, can so refute Kierkegaard as Kierkegaard himself. Reasoning with and judging himself, he corrects his own spirit from its depth, often before it has uttered itself. In 1848, Kierkegaard enters this unforgettable confession in his journal. Had I had, so this is Buber quoting Kierkegaard, had I had faith, I would have stayed with Regina. By this he means, and now these are clearly Buber's own words that he projects onto Kierkegaard, and the third instance of Buber's association of woman with world. If I had really believed that with God all things are possible, hence also my melancholy, my powerlessness, my fear, my alienation fraught with destiny from woman and from world, then I would have stayed with Regina. Following this quote from Kierkegaard's confession, Buber breaks out in an exaltation of marriage as the exemplary bond. Expressed with a view to the man, the woman certainly stands in a dangerous rapport to finitude, and finitude is certainly the danger, for nothing threatens us so sharply as that we remain clinging to it. But our hope of salvation is forged on this very danger, for our human way to the infinite leads only through fulfilled finitude. So, for the better or the worse, you gotta go through it. Although Buber is critical of Kierkegaard's renunciation of woman world in the Christian spirit of Frau Welt and opposes it to Judaism's insistence on an embrace of worldliness as a path to God, Buber hardly rejects the very identification of woman with world as the mortally seductive danger of Lady World's back. And now I'm using on purpose the more dainty mode in English because Buber speaks of the danger. It is indeed dangerous to turn to the world, to woman world, but as I said, you got to do it, unlike Kierkegaard. In her article, Søren Kierkegaard to Martin Buber replied from the Single One. The late critic Gillian Rose fittingly writes that, quote, Buber's notion of the world is overburdened with contrary significations, end of quote. It signifies indeed, for one, Buber's it world, the empirical reality out there in all its anonymity, multiplicity, and everydayness, and for the other, also the necessary instance within which the I-thou relation can take place. This is particularly true where women are concerned. In some instances, woman is described as a reality principle that saves man from the alienation experienced by spirit, by Geist or intellect. At others, she is the world as ultimate sublime, the mighty, quote, the mighty angel of union of which we dreamt in our mother's womb, or else the terrifying other itself. As Buber's critique of Kierkegaard suggests, world is not to be renounced but affirmed, embraced and addressed because it constitutes the potential to form within it the genuine I-thou relation. But this does not efface the remnants of Frau Welt in Buber's view of woman. That this includes its frightening back becomes more obvious in our second example of Buber's association of woman with world. At the end of part 2 of I and Thou, Buber recounts two dreams, and I will only deal with the first of these dreams, which reflects on the dangerous and treacherous lure of two possible pictures of the world implicated in the painful experience of alienation of a single one. At times, I hear sometimes when I read, when I quote Buber, that I take just on the border of caricature, but I'm trying not to do that because it's manipulative, so I will read it soberly. At times when man is overcome by the horror of alienation, Verfremdung, between the I and the world, it occurs to him that something might be done. Imagine that at some dreadful midnight you lie there, tormented by a waking dream. The bulwarks have crumbled and the abysses scream, and you realize in the midst of this agony that life is still there, and I must get through to it. But how? How? Thus feels man in the hours when he collects himself, overcome by horror, pondering without direction, and yet he may know the right direction, deep down in the unloved knowledge of the death, the direction of return that leads through sacrifice. The experience of the singular eye's estrangement from the world, understood here as reality, is described in terms of fear, agony, and dread. All that remains is a glimmer of hope that a reconnection with the world, with life, as opposed to the deadly experience of isolation, is possible. This possibility is called a return. In the context of the book I Thou, this can only refer to the past experience of the primal I-thou relation in the mother's womb before the I's individuation occurring at birth, as Eviatar Varman has pointed out in a very fine paper on the topic. What needs to be sacrificed would, in this case, be the very result of this individuation, the autonomous self, the I itself. But Buber continues, such a return through sacrifice could only occur in a kind of sacrifice of the self, could only occur in a kind of mystical dissolution of this I, an experience that, were it desirable, and for Buber in I Thou, unlike in his early writings, it is clearly not, cannot occur in the abysmal darkness, but only in a mystical union with the divine. Accordingly, the alienated I rejects this solution in this daydream. Buber. It's very strange because I'm usually dealing with literature, so it's not the author, it's the figure, but this is actually not literature, but it is so temptingly close that I was about to say the narrator or the lyrical I, or no, it is Buber. Buber then turns to the alternative of the mystical union, to Logos. The alienated I now engages in a dialogue with his own rational powers, imploring his thought to lend him a grip on the frightful thing, this it of the world that lies out there and from which he is alienated. He summons thought, in which he places quite rightly much confidence. Thought, or philosophy, is supposed to fix everything. After all, it is the lofty art of thought that it can paint a reliable and practically credible picture of the world. Thus, man says to his thought, look at the dreadful shape that lies over there with those cruel eyes. Is she not the one with whom I played long ago? Do you remember how she used to laugh at me with those eyes and how good they were then? In this first picture of the world, Buber clearly alludes again, as in the idea of prenatal bliss, of a natural I-thou, that he ends up calling ein eingeborenes Du, an innate you, to a prior blissful mode of unity with the world in the mother's womb that has for the alienated one transformed into a source of horror, a female demon. At this point, the pronoun is a she, correctly rendered in the feminine by the translator, who obviously understood that the German feminine referred not only to the fact that world in German, die Welt, is feminine. So if it would have, the translator sensed that there was more to this, otherwise he would have said it. So it is she. And now look at my wretched eye. I'll admit it to you, it is empty, and whatever I put into myself, experience as well as use, so the modalities of the I-it, does not penetrate to this cavern. The single one then implores his thought, ever obliging and skillful, or I would say skillfully manipulative. Won't you fix things between her, the world, and me? so that I can get well again? And thought replies with two new pictures of the world. On the right and the left wall. On the one side is the universe, in which the earth and man in it are small and insignificant until a kind of Hegelian Geist builds civilization and culture through history that now carries him forth through the ages to persevere in rebuilding the anthills of the cultures that crumble under its steps. Beneath this series of pictures is written one and all. This picture of the world drawn by thought, by Logos, promises to ward off the dread of the world conceived as a female demon through rebuilding the connection between man and world by thought's own rational powers. So to overcome the alienation, he turns to thought, and the first picture, the first suggestion thought makes is, go to Geist. Maybe Geist will help you. And then it's really a miniature Hegelian universe that emerges. These are the powers of the I as a kind of enlightenment subject, which from the distance of its superiority subjects to itself the threatening female force. While this first picture of the world drawn by thought maintains the distance to the world, overpowers and kind of tames it, the second picture painted by thought, he says, okay, if that doesn't work, try something else, try Seele. On the other wall is not depicted as Geist or Hegel's Weltgeist, but as soul. So, on the other wall happens the soul. A female figure spins the orbits of all stars and the life of all creatures and the whole of world history. All is spun with a single thread and is no longer called stars and creatures and world, but feelings and representations or even living experiences and states of the soul. And beneath this series of pictures is written one and all. So there are two ways to gain the one and all: the Geist or the Seele. While both Geist and Seele misleadingly promise to overcome the alienation from world and end up in achieved oneness and unity, their paths are very different. Geist negates the inner subjective I in the act of objectifying the world and thereby rendering it harmless through a man-made order dominated by culture, institutions, and history. Seele, by contrast, negates the world through turning everything into a figment of the purely subjective self. Characteristically and stereotypically, the Seele is not only a female figure, but her subjectifying act is described as the womanly activity of spinning of threads, one of the female crafts that Noah talked about before. Buber's dream ends on a conjunction of the two pictures of the world. Henceforth, when man is for once overcome by the horror of alienation and the world fills him with anxiety, he looks up, right or left, as the case may be, and sees a picture. Then he sees that the I is contained in the world, so the world that disappears into the it, and that there really is no I, and he calms down. Or he sees that the world is contained in the I, and that there really is no world, and thus the world cannot harm the I, and he calms down. And whichever he sees, it does not matter. Either there's no subjectivity, only the world out there, or the I is submerged in the flood of the world. But Buber concludes, the moment will come, and it is near, when man, overcome by horror, looks up and in a flash sees both pictures at once, and he is seized by a deeper horror. In a prior version, so it's in the German, in the annotations, Buber added, but both are false. A deeper horror takes hold of him because in the conjunction of the two images, there is neither I nor world. The alternate calming dissolution of the I in the it world and of the it world in the I proves to offer only temporary alleviation, and this prepares for the eternal you in the third part that follows right after these two dreams. The two pictures painted in Buber's dream by thought, from which the alienated man looks for solace, correspond precisely to Hegel's concepts of spirit and soul, or Geist and Seele. While both terms encompass aspects of human consciousness and self-awareness, they possess different characteristics and functions within Hegel's framework. Spirit, according to Hegel, encompasses the universal and objective dimension of human consciousness. It transcends the limitations of individual subjectivity and seeks to achieve a higher level of self-awareness and freedom through the dialectic process of history. It embodies the collective consciousness of a society or a nation, shaping its culture, institutions, and ethical norms. Spirit involves a constant striving towards self-realization and the attainment of absolute knowledge, ultimately to Weltgeist. The soul, on the other hand, pertains to the individual's subjective inner life and the realms of emotions, desires, and particularity. Thus, while spirit signifies the collective and universal unfolding of human self-consciousness, soul represents the personal and immediate aspect. Buber rejects as the origin of the deeper horror the conjunction of Hegel's solution, the dialectic reconciliation of subjectivity and objectivity. It is striking that the two female instances invoked in Buber's daydream are both threatening demons. The dreadful shape that is lying there right at the beginning, and the spinning spider-like female figure. These females are world and soul, Welt und Seele. These are the instances when it is associated with a female. But what woman is not is Geist. She is not the spirit. The first female instance is the world, from which the eye is alienated in the first part of the dream. It has two sides, the primal, benevolent one with gentle eyes of a natural eye-thou relation that is established in the maternal womb, and the demonic one, that this benevolent one becomes for the alienated eye prior to a genuine encounter with the Tao that will be developed in the third part, so in the part that then develops. The second female instance is soul, the latter of the two pictures of the world painted by thought. It is the female figure comprising the inner life of the emotions, desires, and particularity. Woman thus has two faces, but, as I said, what it is not is Geist, the realm of culture, of history, of institutions, of objectivity, and of intellect, one of the translations of Geist. While Buber paints both the Wirken, the effectuating by the separate agency of the implicitly male Geist and the explicitly female Seele as negative and in need of being overcome by the eternal I-Thou in the third part, he retains the stereotypical and age-old gender dichotomy between them. Objectivity, history, and the public world is male, subjectivity, interiority, and the life of the emotions is female. In a fragment linked to his I-Thou, the dichotomy between objectifying Weltgeist and subjectifying Seele reappears. Buber describes how man is prone to two illusions, Verweltung und Verseelung, and the latter, so the Verseelung, is by far worse than the first. Worlding and souling, both are to be fought against, but the more evil spirit is souling. For if I throw everything and myself into the it world and see nothing more than it, I find myself being nothing but an atom of the soul, but I only have to waken to myself and find myself facing the world, and reality is open to me again. But if I draw everything into my soul, I know nothing more than it and the world as a Gebilde, then the path to reality disappears from me, reflections and counter-reflections surround me, and my life drowns. So Seele, that as we will see increasingly is female, is the greater danger. It may not be surprising that the objectifying action of the spirit that makes the I disappear into the world, turning it into a puny atom lost in the world, is reversible. There is still the possibility to awaken, to disentangle the I from the world and face it, thereby gaining reality and potentially turning it into a thou. But the action of the soul, Verseelung, leads to irrevocable doom. As in the dream, the soul causes the I to be submerged in the flood of the world. It may be no coincidence that Buber invokes the imagery of drowning and of flood, maybe reminding of the amniotic fluid in the womb. Water, sea, and ocean, as well as nature in general, is traditionally and mythically a metaphor of femininity, a symbol pointing to elemental, undifferentiated womanhood, an emblematic other, mysterious, horrible, and irrational, against which the male subject constructs itself as the guardian of rationality, the lord and master. Or, one could add, the Geist. And my third instance. This gender dichotomy between Geist and Welt, as well as Geist and Seele and nature, is to be found in most succinct ways in Buber's poem, Am Tag der Rückschau, on the day of looking back, that he wrote in 1928 on his 50th birthday, and that he dedicated to his wife Paula. Here, as in the dream, both Welt and Seele are associated with the feminine and Geist with the masculine. But where the dream regards Seele, as confirmed in the fragment with the negative term Verseelung, as a threat to the I whose life risks drowning in purely subjective Innerlichkeit, interiority, the soul, as you will see in the poem, again explicitly feminine, is fully affirmed. Should I read it in German, and those who don't have German can read it in English? Der Schweifende sprach zu mir, ich bin der Geist. Die Schillernde sprach zu mir, ich bin die Welt. Er hatte mich mit Flügeln überkreist, sie hatte mich mit Flammenspiel umstellt. Schon wollte ich ihnen fronen, schon war mein Herz genarrt, da trat vor die Dämonen eine Gegenwart. Paula is coming up. Dem Schweifenden sagte sie, du bist der Wahn, der Schillernden sagte sie, du bist der Trug. Da ward so Geist wie Welt mir aufgetan, die Lüge barst, und was war, war genug. Du wirktest, dass ich schaue, wirktest, du lebtest nur. Brought about, this is my translation, I didn't find the English translation of this poem. So, but I'll come back to the terms. Wirken is working. The word is actually etymologically related to the word. Wirktest du, du lebtest nur. Du Element und Fraue, Seele und Natur. The poem recalls the earlier temptation of the I to subject itself to, literally to serve, two instances that are later called demons, Geist und Welt, or spirit and soul, and the intervention of a presence that rescued the I from their lure. A passage from Buber's My Path to Hasidism, in which he uses the word schweifend, wandering in the sense of erring. So you see, der Schweifende, gives evidence of the autobiographical nature of the poem beyond his birthday occasion. So this comes from My Path to Hasidism. Until my 20th year, and to a lesser extent beyond, my mind was in constant and varied motion, in an ever-changing alternation of tensions and solutions, determined by manifold influences, always assuming new forms, but without center and without growing substance. It was truly the world of confusion, the mythical abode of wandering, and there the term comes out, schweifende Seelen, in which I lived in the moving fullness of Geist, But as without Judaism, so also without humanity and without the presence of the divine. I go back to my poem. As the German original of this passage and the subsequent stanza suggests, the gender of spirit and world is more than mere grammatical. Geist is male. It is the erring one without abode or Heimat. It is, as in the traditional iconography of spirit, depicted as lofty, endowed with wings, as does the Holy Spirit or Ariel in Shakespeare, and hovers above, over and above, überkreist, the eye from the heights. The world, by contrast, is female. She's the one shimmering in iridescent multiple colors, shining but treacherous. La donna immobile, it's that kind of image. So the woman is shimmering in iridescent multiple colors, shining but treacherous and imprisoning the eye with dangerous consuming flames of passion. The male spirit, with its surveying objectification, demands subjection. The female, another Frau Welt, is seducing the eye who risks becoming the world's dupe. These gendered dangers are accordingly respectively called delusion, the false illusion of spirit, and deception, the treacherous effect of world. Both demons, so they are both bad, but delusion is one thing, deception is yet something else, the Seele, der Verseelung. Both demons are defeated by a female Gegenwart, a presence, which is again not only grammatically motivated and doubtlessly pointing to the one the poem is paying tribute to, his wife Paula. Stepping between the eye and these demons, she made him see that both spirits and world are lies, and thereby liberated the speaker from the two forms of choking encirclement. The woman as concrete singular other, as presence, as a thou, opened his eyes to behold the truth about these demons. But the woman as such, as woman, or in the old German form Fraue, nevertheless retains the mythical associations revealed in the poem's final lines. She is Seele und Natur, soul and nature. Woman is thus simultaneously everything good, the primal mother with her gentle eyes and the one who saved him from the demons, and everything terrifying, the seductive demon. But while acknowledging each of these, he remains unwilling to consider the dissonance between them. The most revealing aspect of her mode of being, that is everything but not active Geist, can be found in the verses Du wirkstest, dass ich schaue, wirktest, du lebtest nur. Brought about, you merrily lived. The correction from the active wirken, so to act, to the merrily lived undoes the woman's agency. An earlier version of the poem indeed has the word tun, literally doing, in the place of wirken. Even without referring to the by now well-known active contribution of the concrete woman Paula Buber to Buber's work, the shift is, to put it mildly, problematic. It points to the remnants of the most traditional philosophical dichotomy between the female principle as passive matter and the Geist as active principle animating the universe. So in German philosophy of the 18th and 19th century, this principle manifests itself as Weltgeist, the creative masculine principle opposite to the female passive interiority and nature, Seele und Natur. In a discussion of the dream at the end of part 2 of I Thou, Gillian Rose comments sotto voce on the fictive male dreamer's request that his thought, that Geist, heal him from his alienation from the world, and Rose asks in brackets, what would a woman dream? Rose doesn't elaborate on the question and doesn't provide an answer, but her suggestion that this might be a different dream is noteworthy. A possible answer to her question that leads me to the final part of my talk could be found in the writings of a prominent woman reader of Buber, the avant-garde poet, painter, and performance artist Else Lasker-Schüler. Whether she actually read much of Buber's writings is uncertain, but she knew him, entertained a correspondence with him over decades. Her earliest letter to him dates from December 1913, her latest from August 1943, and went to lectures by him until shortly before her death in Jerusalem in 1945. Laska Schüler's ambivalent attitude towards Buber does, in some ways, prefigure the critique of Buber, particularly where she points to his the misrepresentation of Kierkegaard is concerned. According to Gillian Rose, Buber failed to grasp Kierkegaard's irony, humor, and literary use of pseudonyms. That's a quote. And Gillian Rose, she objects, she says that he painted a straw man in Kierkegaard. And Rose says that the problem is that Buber failed to realize the irony, the humor, and the literary use of pseudonyms. More generally, Rose is critical of Buber's dualistic view of the I-thou that she deems insensitive to injustice and oppressive power relations. We have talked about this and discussed it earlier today, and that denigrates the world regarded as an it without pointing to a possibility of changing it. On all counts of Rose's critique of Buber, Laska Schüler was a master. Her poetry, her prose, and last but not least her letters are playful, humorous, full of irony. She famously slips into the most diverse persona using pseudonyms, most prominently Prince Yusuf, that confound gender categories. Both in her life and her work, she irreverently subverts male authority and indicts the abusive power relations in patriarchal orders. These traits can also be found in her love poetry, even her numerous poems addressed to God as a thou. In all her writings, she reclaims a mighty I, presenting herself as a regal, occasionally even redemptive poetess who self-consciously, if playfully, assigns sovereignty to herself, demolishes tyrannical patriarchs, and rescues the oppressed, the artists, and the poor as victims of the powers that be. Laska Schüler's letters to Buber are full of admiration for his brilliance as a biblical storyteller, as a quote, but they are also spiced with gentle mocking comments targeting his prophet's demeanor, his German professor's habitus, and his pathos. Buber, in his responses to her, obviously admires her poetry, but she was barely part of his actual literary pantheon. Provocatively, she writes to him, "I hate the Jews because I was David or Joseph. I hate the Jews because they disdain my language, because their ears are distorted. I disdain the world, and I visited you often with cynicism, your prince of thieves." In the following letter, she scolds him again for deriding the poets and for not sufficiently honoring her poetry, and complains with characteristically semi-ludic exaggeration. "If you heard me talk all day, you would understand that I'm only talking about myself, that only my poems should be read aloud if you invite me as a guest, that I speak only of myself is out of excessive justice, out of conscientiousness, not just out of self-esteem, namely because I only know myself and can give information only about myself." Some of Laska Schüler's letters addressed to Buber say "I" so insistently that one cannot but wonder if it was her way of reminding Buber, but before he wrote "I Thou," that for the unappreciated woman poetess that she considered herself to be, saying "I" was far from self-evident. Simultaneously and strikingly, her longest letters to Buber throughout are pleas entreating him to help. Here, a poor widow in an insane asylum, there her artist friend Sena Hoy imprisoned in Moscow. And this comes right after affirming that she says only "I." It is tempting, though utterly anachronistic, to read this juxtaposition of playful narcissism and actual action on behalf of others in distress as a comment on Buber's lofty "I Thou." So I'm not saying this, but what can be ascertained is that Laska Schüler does not write about relationality, but enacts it, intensifying and concretizing the I, and caring for the thou, and undermining the gender stereotypes of both, and last but not least, of world. In spite of her reputation as an eccentric dreamer who was often described as living in her own imagination and removed from reality, Liska Schüler neither abnegated the world and its sensual pleasures like Kierkegaard, nor did she regard herself as embodying it, but instead castigates it in her own characteristic, the world, in her own characteristic poetic provocations. Her somewhat childish, I despise the world, written in outrage about the lack of attention for her poetry, so in the letter to Buber, and her contempt for the complacency and stupidity of the bourgeois is transformed into one of her most intricate and powerful poems called Weltflucht, Flight from the World. Ich will in das Grenzenlose zurück, schon blüht die Herbstzeitlose meiner Seele, vielleicht ist schon zu spät zurück, oh ich sterbe unter euch, da ihr mich erstickt mit euch. Fäden möchte ich um mich ziehen, Wirrwarr endend, beirrend, euch verwirrend, zu entfliehen meinwärts. In Liska Schüler's poem, the I does not stand for natural Innerlichkeit, as in the idea of woman as soul, but instead longs to return into herself to find a refuge from the world that chokes her. She feels imprisoned by bourgeois conventions and yearns to retreat into herself. Her dream, a counterpart to Buber's spinning soul that entangles the world, is to spin a cocoon around herself that will allow her to become a butterfly, symbol for poetry and freedom, and to flee from an oppressive world. More importantly, her verses, Wirrwarr endend, beirrend, euch verwirrend, capture the core of her poetics. They express her hope to transform the world and redeem it from confusion. Wirrwarr, interestingly, this is the term Buber uses in his Bible translation with Franz Rosenzweig. It is the term he uses for the tohu vavohu, the wirrwarr, before divine creation. So wirrwarr ended through poetic confusion, so to end confusion through poetic confusion. Wirrwarr endend, beirrend, euch verwirrend. Through confounding established categories, not least the established gender roles and associations. In the title of Liska Schüler's last play, Ich und Ich, written in Jerusalem in the early 1940s, all these aspects, implicitly and sometimes avant la lettre, challenging Buber's thinking, come together. The playful narcissism, the subversion of the autonomous subject in both multiplying and splitting the I, and the freedom to perform rather than define, I and thou and self and soul, in an expression full of spirit, creative agency, and the tenacious refusal to submit to the powers that be and to the world as it is. Be that as it may, Liska Schüler in her poetry and in her life opted to either flee from or change the world rather than be it. And to end, a brief coda. On January 14, 1933, Buber presented his point of view of Jewish-Christian relations in a dialogue with the Protestant New Testament scholar Karl Ludwig Schmidt in the Jewish Lehrhaus in Stuttgart. This speech, which has become famous for its insistence on a radical distinction yet mutual acceptance of Judaism and Christianity, starts with the following words. 1933, okay. I live not far from the city of Worms, to which I'm also bound by a tradition of my ancestors, and I go there from time to time. When I'm there, I always go to the cathedral first. It is a visible harmony of all the parts, a wholeness in which no part falters from perfection, Vollkommenheit. I walk around the cathedral, gazing at it with complete joy. Ich umwandle schauend den Dom mit einer vollkommenen Freude. Then he walks over to the Jewish cemetery, which consists of crooked, shattered, shapeless, directionless stones. I stand in it, look up from this chaotic maze of graves to the glorious harmony of the cathedral, and I feel as if I'm looking up from Israel to the church. Now, could it be that on the many occasions when Buber went to Worms, he really felt complete, full joy when gazing at each single part of the cathedral, as he insists? Did he really see nothing but harmony and perfection? Did the blindfolded synagogue and its companion Frau Welt really escape his scrutiny? Or did he lack discernment out of sheer longing for concord and an all-embracing encounter with the other religion, the other gender? Admirable as it is in many ways, that made him blind to the double-sidedness of his own projections on these others, on his own Frau Welt.